Good evening to the night owls. Good afternoon to the day walkers. And good morning to the rising dead. Welcome to Classified Culture. If you enjoy science fiction and horror stories, then you've come to the right channel. Our goal is to provide quality and original stories for listeners on a regular basis. Every day there will be at least one or two new stories for your listening pleasure. Help this channel grow as a community. You can help by sharing this video, giving it a like, leaving a message in the comments section, and subscribing to the channel. Your feedback and support is always appreciated. Well, I suppose that's enough said for now. It's time for me to do what you all have been waiting for. It's time to let the words I speak guide your imagination with a dark and twisted tale. Nolan Price stepped off the dirt road onto the uneven ground of Blackwood's hollow, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe with an unnatural light. He checked his map again, though he knew it was useless. The terrain had changed too much since it was last surveyed. The only way forward was to trust his instincts and hope they didn't lead him astray. The anonymous assignment had seemed too good to be true. A paid job to investigate an abandoned hunting territory, marked with warnings of danger. It wasn't until he'd arrived at the edge of Blackwood's hollow that Nolan realized the first rule made no sense. There was no safe way into the territory, let alone out again. As he ventured deeper, the air grew thick and heavy, clinging to him like a shroud. The trees here were ancient, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes that seemed almost sentient, reaching out for him with gnarled fingers. He swore one of them moved as he passed, its trunk creaking softly like old bones. Nolan's foot caught on something hidden beneath the undergrowth. He stumbled forward, barely catching himself before face-planting into the dirt. As he straightened up, he saw what had tripped him, a bone, or at least what was left of one. It was small, possibly from a bird or some other creature too degraded to tell for sure. But it was the angle that caught his eye, the way it seemed to bend in two places where no joint existed, like a pretzel made of flesh and gristle. He shook off a sudden chill and continued on, but the sight lingered in his mind's eye, burning itself into his thoughts. Every shadow now seemed to hold some twisted shape. Every rustle hinted at unnatural movement. His skin prickled with unease, as if unseen eyes watched him from all directions. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Nolan found himself in a clearing unlike any other he'd seen so far. The trees here grew in tight clusters, their branches entwined overhead to form a living canopy that blocked out most of the remaining light. At the center stood a single enormous tree, its massive trunk twisted into an almost humanoid shape. Its limbs reached out like skeletal arms, beckoning him closer. Nolan hesitated, then stepped forward, drawn despite himself towards the monstrous tree. As he approached, he noticed something strange about one of its lower branches. A series of deep gouges scored into the bark, as if something had been clawing at it desperately, or trying to break free. He reached out tentatively, tracing the grooves with his fingertips. They were smooth beneath his touch, almost. A shiver ran down his spine, and he pulled his hand away, wiping it instinctively on his jacket. Suddenly, there was a sound behind him, a soft rustle, like fabric against leaves. He spun around but saw nothing except the shadows dancing between the trees. "Hello?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady despite the growing knot of fear in his belly. Silence answered back, heavy and oppressive. Then, faintly, he heard it again. The rustle, now accompanied by a low, wet sound that seemed almost like his heart pounding wildly. Nolan took a step backwards towards the relative safety of the twisted tree trunk. But as he did so, something gave way beneath his foot. He staggered sideways, his arm flailing out for balance. His hand slammed into the tree trunk, and he felt it give slightly under his touch, not like wood shud, but more like bone shifting wrong beneath pressure. A wave of nausea rolled through him at the sensation, and he wrenched his hand away just as something inside the trunk snapped with a sickening crack. The clearing seemed to hold its breath for a moment before erupting into chaos. The rustling sound intensified tenfold, now accompanied by wet tearing noises and harsh gasps that might have been laughter or screams. Shadows moved too fast for him to track, darting between the trees like dark lightning. Nolan stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he fought against the panic rising inside him. He had to get out of there, had to escape whatever nightmare was unfolding around him. But every direction looked the same now, swallowed by darkness and madness. A sudden pain exploded in his left ankle, dropping him to one knee with a cry. Something warm and wet gushed over his hand as he reached down instinctively. The bone had broken through the skin, sticking out at an impossible angle. Blood rose in his throat at the sight, but there was no time for shock or disbelief. He scrambled backwards, ignoring the agony shooting up his leg with every movement. Then he felt it, a cold, damp touch on his calf that sent ice surging through his veins. He kicked out reflexively, connecting with something solid that gave way too easily beneath his boot. There was a wet tearing sound followed by silence so profound it seemed to swallow even his own ragged breathing. Then came the whispers, soft, almost gentle at first, but growing louder and more insistent until they filled his head completely. They spoke in voices not quite human, urging him to stay, to wait, to join them. Nolan pressed his hands against his ears, trying desperately to block out the horrible symphony, but it was no use. The whispers were inside his mind now, burrowing deeper with every passing second. He couldn't trust his own senses. They were being invaded, overwhelmed by something ancient and alien. He stumbled to his feet, tears streaming down his face as he fought against the urge to surrender to the darkness. Using the twisted tree trunk as a guide, he limped away from the clearing, each step sending fresh waves of pain through his shattered ankle. Behind him, the whispers grew louder still, their tones shifting into something more insistent, almost angry. But Nolan didn't look back, not even when he heard the first cracks of splintering wood or felt the cold breath of ancient hunger on his heels. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out beneath him, collapsing onto the damp earth as the world around him seemed to blur into a kaleidoscope of pain and fear. And still, the whispers followed him, echoing through his mind like a chorus of madness. Stay. Wait. Nolan Price was alive, but at what cost had he survived the first night in Blackwood's Hollow? Only time would tell if he'd escaped with more than just shattered bones and shattered sanity. Nolan woke with a start, his breath coming in ragged gasps as if he'd been running through endless nightmares. The whispers still echoed in his mind, their icy tendrils clinging to his thoughts like frost on glass. He shivered, trying to banish them along with the cold that seeped into his bones from the dew-kissed earth. His ankle throbbed mercilessly, a brutal reminder of last night's ordeal. The bone had set itself at an unnatural angle during the night, but Nolan refused to look too closely, fearing what he might find. Instead, he tore strips from his shirt and bound it tightly, gritting his teeth against the pain. As light filtered through the canopy above, Blackwood's Hollow seemed almost peaceful. Almost. The twisted trees stood sentinel around him, their humanoid shapes looming ominously despite the day's advance. Nolan wondered if they ever truly slept or if they were awake, watching, waiting. He forced himself to his feet, using a nearby trunk for support. His ankle protested bitterly, but held firm enough for him to limp forward. The first rule, leave by sundown, had cost him dearly, and he had no intention of staying another night. As he hobbled deeper into the territory, Nolan noticed something unsettling. Blood already dried in places no one had entered yet. It was as if the very ground bled from wounds inflicted long ago, yet remained untouched by time or weather. He felt a creeping unease take root within him, sending tendrils of dread coiling around his spine. The forest seemed to grow denser with each step, branches reaching out like skeletal fingers to snag at his clothes and hair. And the silence, it was absolute, as if every creature within miles held its breath in anticipation or terror. Nolan couldn't shake the feeling that something ancient and malevolent lay hidden just beyond his perception. His sense of direction wavered amidst the twisted paths and eerie landmarks. Every tree looked like the last, their grotesque forms warped by some unnatural force. He began to fear he'd never find his way out. Had he crossed an invisible boundary into another world entirely? Nolan stumbled upon a small clearing where something had clearly been burned. Charred remnants of wood and bone lay scattered across the ground like morbid confetti, while blackened footprints marked a hasty retreat from whatever horror had unfolded there. As he limped closer to investigate, one of the prints seemed to shift beneath his gaze, a subtle movement that sent nausea roiling through him. He looked again, blinking away tears of pain and fear. The footprint was indeed moving, slowly but deliberately reshaping itself into something far more sinister. A hand with elongated fingers tipped by razor-sharp claws. Nolan stumbled back, heart pounding wildly in his chest. His ankle gave way beneath him, sending him crashing to the ground just as the monstrous appendage lunged for his throat. But instead of tearing through flesh, it merely brushed against his skin. A cold, damp touch that left behind a trail of dried blood. He scrambled away, horrified by the sight of his own blood already staining the earth around him. How was this possible? The wound had been made mere seconds ago, and yet here it lay, congealing under the sun's rays as if it had happened days past. The whispers returned then, louder and more insistent than ever before. They seemed to echo not just within his mind, but all around him, whispering from the trees, the ground, even his own bones. He clamped his hands over his ears, but it did no good. Their voices were inside him now, burrowing deeper with every passing moment. Stay. Wait. Join us. Nolan felt something shift deep within his psyche. A terrible sense of resignation began to take root. Part of him wanted nothing more than to give in, to surrender to the darkness, and join whatever ancient force held sway over Blackwood's hollow. But another part, the last shreds of his sanity, refused to yield. With a cry born of desperation and defiance, Nolan forced himself back onto his feet and limped away from the clearing. He couldn't outrun the whispers. They were inside him now, but he could damn well try. As he moved deeper into the twisted territory, Nolan noticed more signs of unnatural decay. Skin-like bark peeling off trees to reveal bone-white wood beneath. Roots writhing like serpents across the forest floor, and the ever-present blood dried where it should not be. Each grotesque sight only served to strengthen his resolve, even as fear clawed at his heart. He came upon a stream, its waters dark and sluggish despite the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. As he knelt to splash some onto his face, something caught his eye, a glint of metal half buried in the muddy bank. He reached for it, fingers brushing against cold, familiar steel. It was a pocket knife, its blade stained dark with age or blood, or perhaps both. Inscribed on one side were words that sent ice surging through his veins. "For my beloved sister, so we may always be together." The inscription was signed simply, M. Nolan had found no mention of any sisters in Morgan's notes about Blackwood's hollow. Could this belong to someone else who'd ventured into these accursed woods? And if so, what had become of them? The question barely formed before he heard it. The faintest of sounds carried on the breeze, a soft, rhythmic tapping against wood. It seemed almost musical, like an intricate Morse code tapped out by some unseen musician. Following the sound led Nolan deeper into madness. He discovered a grove where trees had grown together in twisted harmony, their branches interweaving overhead to form a natural cathedral. And there, suspended from the highest branch by what appeared to be lengths of rope made from human hair, hung the source of the tapping. A figure dressed in rags, its head lolling forward to reveal a face frozen in silent scream. Nolan approached cautiously, heart pounding wildly in his chest. As he reached out tentative fingers to touch the corpse's cheek, he noticed something horrifying. It was still moving, the jaw opening and closing, eyes rolling back and forth beneath closed lids. The whispers swelled around him then, their voices rising together in a cacophony of madness. Stay. Wait. Join us. Nolan stumbled backwards, hands pressed against his ears, as if that could somehow block out the insidious invasion of his senses. But it was no use. They were inside him now, part of him, as much a part of Nolan Price as his own flesh and blood. He turned to run, fleeing from the grove and all its horrors. But as he limped away, he felt something shift deep within his psyche, a terrible realization dawning upon him with chilling certainty. He could no longer tell where the whispers ended and his own thoughts began. Nolan Price had found something truly terrifying hidden within Blackwood's hollow, something that would haunt him long after he'd escaped its twisted embrace, or in his desperation to uncover the truth. Nolan's breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled away from the grove, his mind reeling with the horrors he'd witnessed. Each step sent jolts of pain up his injured ankle, but it was a welcome distraction from the whispers that now echoed relentlessly within him. Stay. Wait. Join us. The forest seemed to have changed once more, its twisted trees looming ever closer, as if intent on swallowing him whole. He knew he should keep moving, find some way out of this godforsaken place before sundown. But how could he trust his own senses now? Everything felt wrong, surreal. Ahead, something caught his eye. A set of footprints leading off the main path, disappearing into dense underbrush. They were unlike any animal tracks he'd seen before, too large and strange in shape, as if their maker walked on twisted, misshapen feet. Yet they seemed human enough, with clear impressions of toes and heels dug deep into the damp earth. Nolan hesitated, then followed them. His instincts screamed at him to run. But another part, a darker part, whispered insidious suggestions that these tracks might lead him deeper into Blackwood's hollow rather than out. He ignored it, or tried to, focusing instead on placing his feet carefully in the prints before him. The further he went, the more convinced Nolan became that something unnatural had happened here. The prints didn't simply deviate from the path. They seemed almost defiant of natural movement, as if their creator had deliberately chosen this route through the forest. And there were other signs too, marks on trees where bark had been stripped away in long, thin strips, leaving behind raw wounds that oozed sap like blood from severed arteries. Soon enough, he realized why the footprints seemed so familiar. They matched those leading into the clearing with the burned remains. But these went further, deeper into territory unexplored by anyone, except whatever horrors now haunted Blackwood's hollow. Nolan paused, listening hard. The whispers had fallen silent, but there was another sound now, a low, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to throb in time with his heartbeat. It made his skin crawl, raised the hairs on the back of his neck. He couldn't quite place it, yet it felt wrong. He pressed on, drawn forward despite himself. The forest grew denser still, until he was pushing through branches that snapped like dry bone beneath his touch. Then, suddenly, he emerged into another clearing, and what he saw there made him gasp aloud. A circle of trees stood guard around a large, flat stone slab. Carved into its surface were symbols Nolan recognized from Morgan's notes. Sigils meant to ward off evil spirits, protect against dark forces. But here they seemed laughable, pathetic attempts at defiance against whatever had taken residence in these woods. Upon the slab lay a body, or what remained of one. It was naked, pale flesh exposed to the elements, and wrong. Terribly wrong. Nolan approached cautiously, eyes wide with horror, as he took in the scene. The corpse's limbs were splayed unnaturally, joints bent at angles that defied human anatomy, skin stretched out across its frame, pulled tight like parchment over a drum. And there, along its length, were lines, deep cuts where something had begun to peel back the flesh, revealing glimpses of bone and sinew beneath. Nolan forced himself closer, despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. He needed to know what he was dealing with here, even if it meant confronting his own mortality head-on. As he leaned in to examine the wounds more closely, something caught his eye, a movement beneath the skin, like a ripple running along its surface. He froze, watching as that same ripple passed through the corpse's arm again, causing the muscles to twitch involuntarily. Then it happened again, in the leg, this time, and Nolan realized with dawning horror what he was witnessing. Bone shifting wrong beneath its pressure, moving independently of one another, as if controlled with some unseen... Revulsion churned in his gut, threatening to spill forth. But before he could react, something grabbed him, claws digging into his shoulders, pulling him backwards away from the slab. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. All he could do was stare into the twisted face of whatever held him captive. It was humanoid in shape, though barely recognizable as such. His skin hung loose and torn, revealing glimpses of flesh beneath that seemed almost translucent, like wet paper. Eyes burned with malevolent intelligence, pupils dilated until they filled the entire iris. And its mouth was a ragged wound, filled with teeth sharp as needles and stained black with blood. Nolan struggled against its grip, thrashing wildly as panic surged through him. But it was no use. Those claws held fast, digging deeper into his flesh until he felt warm blood trickling down his back. Then, suddenly, they released him and sent him sprawling onto the ground beside the corpse. He lay there, panting, trying desperately to regain control of his senses. Above him loomed the creature, its form seeming to shift and change even as he watched, bones popping beneath skin that stretched taut before splitting open, revealing glimpses of something ancient and terrifying within. "Stay. Wait. Join us." The whispers returned, louder now, insistent. They echoed through Nolan's mind, drowning out his own thoughts until there was nothing left but their relentless cacophony. "Stay. Wait. Join us." He tried to crawl away, fingers clawing at the earth as he sought escape from this nightmare. But with each movement came pain, a sharp, burning agony that radiated outward from deep within his body. He looked down and saw why. Bones shifting wrong beneath pressure, moving independently of one another as if controlled by some unseen force. It was happening to him too. To Nolan Price, journalist, seeker of truth, fool enough to venture into Blackwood's hollow alone. His joints twisted unnaturally, tendons snapping like overstretched rubber bands. Skin split open along his arms and legs, revealing glimpses of bone and sinew beneath. And through it all, the whispers grew louder still. "Stay. Wait. Join us." Nolan screamed, a raw primal sound torn from deep within his ravaged throat. Then darkness claimed him, mercifully blocking out the horrors that now consumed both body and mind. Yet even unconsciousness offered no refuge. For in dreams he was joined by others, men and women twisted beyond recognition, their bodies writhing together in unholy communion. When consciousness returned, so too did pain. The dull throb of bruised flesh, the sharp ache of torn muscle. Nolan lay there for what felt like hours, unwilling or unable to move, until finally he mustered enough strength to push himself onto his hands and knees. His body protested violently at first, limbs trembling, joints popping, but eventually they gave way beneath him, allowing him to rise shakily to his feet. He stood there, swaying slightly, as the full extent of his injuries became apparent. Cuts along his arms and legs, deep gouges where claws had. Nolan stood trembling at the edge of the clearing, staring at the lifeless form upon the stone slab. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale burning like fire in his lungs. The light was fading fast, shadows stretching out across the forest floor like eager tendrils. Panic clawed at him as he realized how long he'd been here, lost in morbid fascination. "Stupid," he muttered to himself, wiping sweat and blood from his forehead with a shaking hand. "So goddamn stupid." He turned away from the corpse, intent on retracing his steps back to the safety of the ranger station. But as he moved, the forest seemed to shift around him, trees leaning in too close, branches intertwining overhead to block out what little remained of the day's light. Panic surged through him again, hot and acidic. He stumbled forward, fingers brushing against rough bark as he sought a path through the twisted maze. But every turn led only deeper into Blackwood's hollow, each direction looking much like the last. Twisted footprints marring the undergrowth, trees stripped bare of their bark, oozing sap like blood from 1,000 cuts. He stopped abruptly, pressing his back against a gnarled trunk as he tried to get his bearings. The whispers were back too, louder now, insistent. A chorus of voices echoing through his mind, each one crying out in pain and terror. Join us. Stay with us. Wait. Nolan clamped his hands over his ears, squeezing his eyes shut against the onslaught. But it was no use. The whispers were inside him now, reverberating within his own skull. He slid down the tree trunk until he sat huddled on the ground, knees drawn up to his chest, rocking back and forth like a child lost in nightmare. How long he stayed there, he couldn't say. Time seemed elastic here, stretching out interminably before snapping back suddenly, leaving him disoriented and confused. But eventually, as darkness claimed the forest, Nolan forced himself to stand. He had to keep moving. If he didn't, he'd never find his way out. He chose a direction at random. Left seemed as good as any, and set off again, stumbling through the underbrush with one hand outstretched, fingers trailing along tree trunks for guidance. The forest was deathly silent now, save for the occasional rustle of leaves beneath his feet and the harsh sound of his own ragged breathing. But then came another noise, a wet, tearing sound that sent shivers down Nolan's spine. It echoed through the darkness, seeming to come from all directions at once. He froze, listening intently as it grew louder, closer. And with it came something else, a low, rhythmic thrumming, like the beating of some vast, diseased heart. Something moved in the darkness ahead, a shadow detaching itself from the others, sliding sinuously towards him. Nolan backed away, eyes wide with terror, but there was nowhere to run, no escape from this nightmare creature that seemed to know his every move before he made it. Then suddenly it was upon him, the dark shape resolving into form as it lunged, claws extended, teeth bared in a snarl of hunger and malice. Nolan threw up his arms instinctively, but too late. Those terrible claws raked across his chest, tearing through cloth and flesh alike with sickening ease. He fell backwards, crashing to the ground amidst a flurry of leaves and pain. His attacker loomed above him, a monstrous parody of humanity, its body twisted into impossible angles, skin stretched taut over bones that shifted beneath like snakes beneath skin. Its eyes were pits of darkness, absorbing all light, reflecting none back. Stay. Wait. Join us. The whispers reached a crescendo, drowning out everything but their own relentless chanting. Nolan felt something stirring within him, an ancient, malevolent force clawing at the edges of his mind, demanding release. He tried to fight it, to push back against that dark tide, but it was too strong, too vast. His limbs began to move independently, jerking and twitching, like those of a marionette controlled by some unseen puppeteer. He watched in horror as his arms rose up, hands reaching out towards the creature standing over him. Its own claws reached back, grasping his wrists with bone-crushing strength. Nolan screamed, and then everything went still. The creature released him abruptly, stepping back into the shadows, as if satisfied by some unseen ritual. Around them, the forest fell silent once more, the whispers fading away like distant thunder after a storm has passed. Nolan lay there, panting, trying desperately to regain control of his senses, but it was no use. Those claws held fast, digging deeper into his flesh until he felt warm blood trickling down his back. Then suddenly, they released him and sent him sprawling onto the ground beside the corpse. He looked up at the creature standing over him, a terrible figure wreathed in shadows, its form seeming to shift and change even as he watched. Bones popped beneath skin that stretched taut before splitting open, revealing glimpses of something ancient and terrifying within. It reached out towards him, one long finger tracing a line down his cheek. "You are ours now," it whispered, no longer with the voices of 1,000 lost souls, but with a single voice, cold and cruel as winter's first frost. "Join us. Stay with us." Wait. Nolan felt something within him snap, the last vestiges of his sanity shattering like glass. He scrambled away from that horrible touch, fingers clawing at the earth as he sought escape from this nightmare. But with each movement came pain, a sharp, burning agony that radiated outward from deep within his body. He looked down and saw why. Bones shifting wrong beneath pressure, moving independently of one another as if controlled by some unseen force. It was happening to him too, to Nolan Price, journalist, seeker of truth, fool enough to venture into Blackwood's hollow alone. His joints twisted unnaturally, tendons snapping like overstretched rubber bands. Skin split open along his arms and legs, revealing glimpses of bone and sinew beneath. And through it all, the creature watched him, its eyes never leaving his face as he underwent that terrible transformation. When finally Nolan lay still, breath ragged, body racked with pain, it leaned down close, so close he could feel its icy breath against his ear. "You are one of us now," it whispered, a single voice echoing through the emptiness of his own ravaged mind. "Forever." Then darkness claimed him, the mercy of oblivion, stealing away consciousness just as surely as death itself might claim a life. Yet even unconsciousness offered no refuge, for in dreams he was joined by others, men and women twisted beyond recognition, their bodies writhing together in unholy communion. When consciousness returned, so too did pain, the dull throb of bruised flesh, the sharp ache of torn muscle. Nolan lay there for what felt like hours, unwilling or unable to move, until finally he mustered enough strength to push himself onto his hands and knees. His body protested violently at first. Nolan's breath came in ragged gasps, each inhalation laced with the metallic tang of blood and the earthy scent of decay. He stumbled forward, half walking, half crawling towards the dim silhouette of a cabin nestled amongst the gnarled trees. His body protested with every movement, bones grinding against one another, skin stretched taut over wounds that refused to close. But he pushed on, driven by primal instinct and the desperate need for shelter. The cabin loomed before him like a dark monolith, its once red door now faded to a sickly rust color. It stood alone amidst the twisted forest, untouched by time or weather, as if waiting for his arrival. A shiver ran down Nolan's spine, but he ignored it, forcing himself up the creaking steps and onto the worn porch. The door groaned open at his touch, revealing a yawning maw of darkness. Inside, the air was thick with dust and something else, something cloying and sweet that caught in the back of his throat. He gagged, retching onto the faded rug beneath his feet. His stomach churned as he straightened, eyes watering from the effort. Then he saw it, blood, already dried in places no one had entered yet. It was everywhere, spattered across the walls like macabre abstract art, pooled on the floorboards, congealed into thick, blackened smears around the baseboards. The smell was overwhelming, metallic and sickeningly sweet, like old pennies left too long in the sun. His stomach heaved again, but there was nothing left to bring up except bile. Nolan stumbled deeper into the cabin, his mind racing with questions he dared not voice aloud. Who had been here before him? What had happened to them? And why did it feel as though they were still present, watching from the shadows? The cabin consisted of a single room, or rather, what had once been a single room now divided into chaotic segments by rotting walls and collapsed ceilings. A bed frame lay upended in one corner, its springs rusted through and mattress stained with something darker than age. Across from it, a wooden table stood on end, two chairs still tucked neatly beneath despite the chaos around them. In the center of the room, suspended from the rafters by lengths of fraying rope, hung a noose. It swayed gently in the draft from the open door, creaking softly like an old man's bones. Beneath it lay a desk, its surface clear except for a single item, an antique pocket watch, its case tarnished and hands frozen at 3:13. Nolan reached out tentatively, fingers brushing against the cool metal. Then, suddenly, he felt it. Something shifting beneath his touch, bones grinding unnaturally as they twisted in ways they were never meant to move. He snatched his hand back, staring wide-eyed at the watch as if it might bite him. But there was no more movement. The sensation had been fleeting, like a phantom pain remembered from another life. Still, Nolan hesitated, uncertain whether to take the watch or leave it behind. In the end, he did neither. Instead, he turned away, leaving the tarnished timepiece where it lay amidst the wreckage of whatever life once belonged here. He needed warmth, rest, something to ease the pain that gnawed at him like a physical hunger. But there was nothing here save for ruin and decay. No firewood, no blankets, not even an intact chair upon which he might sit without fear of collapse. So instead, Nolan made his way to the bed, careful to avoid the rotted spots where the springs poked through like skeletal fingers. As he lowered himself onto the mattress, he felt it, the same unnatural shifting beneath him as before, but now amplified tenfold. His bones ground against one another, joints popping and snapping like dry kindling. Skin stretched out across his body, threatening to split open once more. He cried out, clawing at the bedding in an attempt to escape whatever held him captive. But there was nothing there. No unseen force pinning him down. No creature crouched atop his chest. Just the mattress beneath him, its fabric worn smooth by years of use and misuse. And yet still, the sensations persisted, bones moving independently of one another, skin splitting open along lines that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Panic surged within him, hot and wild, threatening to consume all rational thought. He scrambled away from the bed, back pressing against the wall as he watched in horror while his body continued its slow transformation. His hands trembled uncontrollably, fingers bending at unnatural angles until they resembled nothing so much as twisted tree roots. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Nolan slumped forward, breath coming in ragged gasps as he surveyed the damage. His hands looked almost normal now, though there remained a slight tremor that refused to subside entirely. But his body was another matter altogether. His shirt hung in tattered ruins around him, exposing skin scored with deep lacerations that seemed almost intentional, deliberate cuts made by some unseen hand. They followed the lines of his muscles, tracing paths down his arms and across his chest like gruesome tattoos. And though they bled freely at first, clotting almost immediately, there was no pain, not anymore. It was as if his nerves had been cauterized, severed from their connection to the rest of him. He could feel nothing save for the dull throb of exhaustion that weighed heavy upon his limbs. Yet still he hesitated before removing his shirt completely, fearing what else he might find hidden beneath the fabric. But there was no choice, not if he hoped to survive this place. So, with great effort, he peeled away the ruined remnants of his clothing, revealing flesh scored and scarred by unseen hands. His breath hitched in his throat as he took in the full extent of his injuries, each cut a testament to the horrors he'd endured thus far. And yet, amidst it all, something else caught his eye, something barely visible amidst the welter of wounds and scars. A mark perhaps, or merely a trick of the light, but nonetheless worth investigating further. He leaned closer, squinting at the faint outline etched into his skin. Suddenly, a noise echoed through the cabin, a soft scraping sound that seemed to come from all around him at once. Nolan froze, heart pounding wildly in his chest as he strained to listen. There it was again, the scrape of bone against bone, followed by a low growl that sent shivers down his spine. He knew that sound, had heard it before amidst the twisted ruins of Blackwood's hollow. It was the sound of something ancient and terrible awakening from its slumber deep within the earth. And now, it seemed, whatever that thing was, it had found him once more. But there was no escape this time, no dark forest into which he might flee, nor hidden corners where he could hide until dawn broke upon the world anew. For Nolan Price was trapped here trapped within this ruined cabin with whatever monster haunted its decaying halls. And as darkness claimed, Nolan's heart thundered in his chest like a trapped animal as he pressed himself against the wall beside the cracked door. The noises outside were unmistakably alive, a cacophony of scraping, shuffling, and wet, sucking sounds that defied any semblance of natural origin. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to comply, rooted in place by sheer terror. Through the narrow gap between door and frame, he caught sight of unnatural shadows cast upon the wall opposite. They seemed to writhe and contort independently of their sources, stretching grotesquely out of proportion before snapping back into place with an audible pop. His eyes widened as he watched one particularly monstrous shadow twist itself into a shape that bore no resemblance to anything human or animal. A writhing mass of angles and curves that seemed to pulse with an inner rhythm. His breath hitched in his throat when the shadows began to coalesce, merging together until they formed a single amorphous blob. It throbbed like a heartbeat, expanding and contracting as if taking form around some unseen center. Then, without warning, it exploded outward into dozens of smaller shapes that scrambled across the floor like insects. Nolan's stomach churned at the sight, bile rising in his throat as he watched those writhing forms inch closer to him. They seemed almost fluid, their limbs bending and twisting at angles no joint should allow. Bones creaked and cartilage popped with every movement, yet there was no pause or hesitation, only a relentless, ceaseless advance. He pressed himself harder against the wall, willing his body to become one with it, but his muscles refused to obey. Instead, they trembled violently beneath his skin, threatening to betray him at any moment. Sweat beaded on his forehead and upper lip, trickling downwards in cold rivulets that seemed to burn like acid. The creatures were close now, too close. He could hear their ragged breathing, smell the sour stench of decay emanating from their rotting flesh. And still, they kept coming, drawn inexorably towards him by some unnatural compulsion. Then, suddenly, one of them was there, right on the other side of the door, mere inches away from Nolan's face. He could see every grim detail through the crack, the milky film over its eyes, the way its jaw hung slack, revealing rows of jagged teeth stained black with dried blood. The skin stretched taut across its skull like parchment pulled too tight. But worst of all were its hands, those twisted, gnarled claws that seemed to have a life of their own. They scrabbled against the door frame, nails clicking and tapping like some hideous Morse code. And as Nolan watched in horror, he saw those fingers begin to bend backwards at impossible angles, knuckles popping loudly enough to make him flinch. His breath caught in his throat as realization dawned. It was trying to reach through the crack, trying to touch him. Panic surged within him, a desperate primal scream that demanded release. But before he could act upon that impulse, another sound froze him in place. A soft, wet click from behind him. He knew that sound too. It was the same noise he'd heard earlier when exploring the cabin, the sound of bones shifting beneath pressure. Only this time, it wasn't coming from outside the door. It was coming from within the room itself. Slowly, ever so slowly, Nolan turned his head towards the sound. His eyes widened in disbelief at what they beheld. There, standing amidst the ruins of the cabin's once grand interior, was a figure all too familiar. The man he'd seen hanging from the noose earlier that day. Only now, there were significant differences. For one thing, the corpse was no longer quite so lifeless. Its limbs twitched and spasmed, as if controlled by some unseen marionette master, jerking and twitching with a sickening rhythm that seemed almost. For another, its eyes were open, wide open in fact, and staring directly at Nolan with an unnerving intensity. But perhaps most horrifying of all was the way the corpse's mouth hung open. Those lifeless lips parted to reveal rows upon rows of tiny, wriggling things. They writhed and squirmed within the darkness of its throat like maggots in rotting meat, their segmented bodies glistening with moisture as they fought desperately for purchase. Nolan felt bile rise in his throat once more at the sight, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from those repulsive creatures. They seemed to fill him with an overwhelming sense of dread and revulsion, unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. A feeling that went far beyond mere fear or disgust. It was as if some ancient part of his brain recognized these things for what they were. Abominations born from the very fabric of madness itself. And suddenly, he knew with absolute certainty that if those creatures gained entry into this world, all would be lost. All hope, all reason, all humanity would be consumed by their insatiable hunger. He had to stop them, had to find a way to destroy these monstrosities before they could spread any further. But how? How did one fight against such nightmares made manifest? His mind raced, searching frantically for an answer, while his body remained frozen in terror. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the corpse's mouth snapped shut, silencing those wriggling horrors within its depths. Its eyes fluttered closed once more, and its limbs went still. For a long moment, Nolan stood there, hardly daring to breathe as he waited for some sign that this wasn't merely another trick of his tormentors. But nothing happened. No more wet clicks or scraping sounds. No further signs of unnatural movement. It was almost as if the creature had never existed at all. Slowly, cautiously, Nolan allowed himself to relax just slightly. His breath came in ragged gasps now, chest heaving like a man who'd run a marathon without stopping. He leaned back against the wall, letting its rough surface support him while his limbs shook uncontrollably from the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. But even as relief coursed through him, another emotion began to take hold: anger. How dare they do this to him? How dare they violate his senses like this, twist his perceptions until he could no longer trust his own eyes? He clenched his fists, nails digging into palms hard enough to draw blood. He would not succumb to fear, would not let them win so easily. No matter what horrors lay ahead, he vowed then and there that he would face them head-on, unafraid and unyielding. But even as he made this silent pledge, a tiny voice whispered at the back of his mind, "What if it's already too late? What if you've already become accustomed to the horror?" A shiver ran down Nolan's spine at that thought, but he refused to acknowledge it. Instead, he pushed himself away from the wall and stepped forward, ready to confront whatever awaited him in the darkness beyond. As he did so, a sudden noise made him pause, a soft, wet sound coming from somewhere nearby. Nolan stood there, listening to the silence that seemed to throb with anticipation. The wet click had stopped, but he knew better than to trust it. His eyes were drawn back to the door, where the creature had tried to reach him through the crack. He could still see the unnatural angle of its fingers, bent backwards like a spider's leg. He forced himself to move, sidestepping around the room, putting as much distance between himself and the door as possible. His footsteps echoed in the small space, each one sounding louder than the last. He reached the window opposite the door and pressed his back against the wall beside it, peering out into the darkness. The moon had moved, casting different shadows across the ground now. It was enough to make him question what he'd seen before. Had those creatures really been there? Or had his mind played tricks on him again? A noise made him jump, a soft, rhythmic tapping sound coming from somewhere above him. He looked up, eyes scanning the ceiling for any sign of movement. Nothing. But the tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone counting out time with their fingers. He swallowed hard, trying to wet his suddenly dry throat. His heart pounded in his chest, echoing the tapping noise above him. Sweat trickled down his spine. Despite the chill in the air, he felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to scream, but he bit it back, clamping his jaw shut so tightly that his teeth ached. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Now there was only silence again, thick and heavy around him. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but his lungs seemed to have forgotten how to work properly. They burned with each inhalation, as if filled with acid instead of air. He tried to tell himself that he was safe here, that the creatures couldn't reach him inside the cabin, but even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't true. They'd proven that already by getting into his mind, twisting his perceptions until he could no longer trust his own senses. A creaking noise made him tense, muscles coiling like springs ready to snap. It came from behind him, near the door where he'd heard the bone-shifting sound earlier. He turned slowly, eyes wide with fear as he searched for the source of the noise. There, in the corner beside the door, something moved. It was dark and shadowy, but he could make out the shape nonetheless, a long, writhing form that seemed to pulse with an inner light. As he watched, it began to change shape, stretching and twisting until it resembled a monstrous parody of a human figure. Nolan felt bile rise in his throat as he watched those unnatural limbs reach out towards him, fingers bending backwards at impossible angles. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to listen. He was frozen in place, held captive by sheer terror. The creature took another step forward, its movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette controlled by an incompetent puppeteer. Nolan could see now that it wasn't just shadows playing tricks on his eyes. The thing was real, made of flesh and bone despite its grotesque appearance. It took another step, then another, each one bringing it closer to him until he could feel its breath on his face, hot and rank with decay. He gagged involuntarily, the smell of rotting meat filling his nostrils and making his stomach churn. But still, he couldn't move. The creature reached out towards him again, those backwards bending fingers brushing against his cheek. He flinched away from it, but not fast enough to avoid feeling the rough, bony tips scrape against his skin. A line of blood welled up where its nail had cut into him, and he felt a wave of revulsion so strong that it almost knocked him off his feet. But still, he couldn't run. It was as if those unnatural fingers had dug into his flesh and wrapped around his spine, holding him firmly in place while the creature did whatever it wanted to him. And then, suddenly, everything changed. The creature seemed to lose interest in him, its gaze shifting past him towards something else entirely. Its body went still for a moment before beginning to convulse violently, bones snapping and popping beneath its skin like kernels of popcorn exploding in a microwave. Nolan watched in horror as the thing tore itself apart from the inside out, skin splitting open along every seam until it resembled nothing so much as a broken puppet with all its stuffing spilling out onto the floor. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone, dissolved into a pile of rotting flesh and shattered bones that seemed to absorb back into the darkness around them. For several long moments, Nolan stood there, staring at the spot where the creature had been mere seconds before. Then slowly, he began to lower himself down onto his hands and knees, body shaking with exhaustion and relief. But even as he did so, another noise made him freeze, a soft, wet clicking sound coming from somewhere nearby. He knew that sound now. It was the same one he'd heard earlier, when those creatures had merged together into something new and terrifying. And this time, there was no doubt in his mind who, or what, was making the noise. Nolan spent the rest of the night huddled against the wall beside the window, listening to the sounds coming from outside. The clicking noises continued intermittently throughout the night, always followed by more bone-shifting creaks and groans that seemed to echo through every fiber of his being. He tried to tell himself that it was just his imagination playing tricks on him again, that there couldn't possibly be real creatures out there making those sounds. But deep down, he knew better. He'd seen them now, had felt their unnatural touch against his skin. They were real, and they were here for him. As the hours passed, Nolan found himself growing increasingly disoriented. It was difficult to tell where the sounds were coming from anymore. Sometimes they seemed right outside the window, while other times they appeared to be coming from inside the cabin itself. He couldn't trust his senses, couldn't trust anything except the pounding of his own heart and the ragged gasps of his breath. At one point, he swore that something brushed against his foot, but when he looked down, there was nothing there except shadows. Still, he pulled his feet up onto the window ledge, hugging them tightly to his chest as if they could somehow protect him from whatever horrors lurked in the darkness around him. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and Nolan found himself drifting off into a fitful sleep despite his best efforts to stay awake. His dreams were filled with images of those creatures, their backwards bending fingers digging into his flesh, their bone-shifting bodies merging together until they formed something even more terrifying than before. When he finally woke again, it was to the sound of birdsong outside his window. For a moment, he lay there listening to the cheerful melody, trying to convince himself that everything was normal now, that those horrors had been nothing but a bad dream. But then he moved, shifting his weight just slightly on the floor beside the window. Nolan's breath hitched in his throat as he took in the sight before him. The underground stream gurgled past, its waters a murky, tainted red. Bodies lay strewn along its banks and floated face down in the current, their limbs snagged on submerged rocks or debris. They were bloated and pale, eyes glassy and staring, mouths open in silent screams. He stepped closer, his boots squelching in the damp earth. The bodies bore signs of unnatural trauma, limbs bent at impossible angles, skin split where it shouldn't be, bones shifting beneath flesh like worms burrowing through soil. The air was thick with the stench of decay, but there was something else too, something familiar and revolting that made Nolan's stomach churn. Among them was Morgan, her contact from the assignment. Her eyes were wide open, fixed on some unseen horror above. Her body was twisted, one arm bent backwards at an angle that would have been painful even in life. But what drew Nolan's gaze were the markings etched into her flesh, deep gouges that seemed to pulse with a sickening energy. He knelt beside her, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. He reached out a tentative hand, touching her cold cheek. There was no rigor mortis here. Instead, her body seemed to yield beneath his touch, as if the very essence of her being had been leached away. As he pulled his hand back, something caught his eye, a glint of metal against her index finger. He leaned in closer, squinting at the object. A wedding ring. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that Morgan wasn't just some nameless casualty. She was someone's wife, someone's partner. And now she was this. Nolan felt bile reason in his throat, but he swallowed it down. There would be time for grief later, if there ever was a later. Right now, he needed answers. He stood up, scanning the rest of the gruesome tableau. How many were there? 5? 6? 7? And what had done this to them? His gaze fell upon something that made his blood run cold. A figure lay face down in the water, one arm outstretched towards the bank. As Nolan stepped closer, he saw that it was a child, no more than 10 years old. The boy's back was a ruin of torn flesh and shattered bone, as if something had burst forth from inside him. Nolan felt bile Riza again, but this time there was no holding it back. He retched violently, falling to his knees beside the stream. His body convulsed with each heave, tears streaming down his cheeks. This wasn't just horror anymore. It was a physical assault on everything he held dear. As his spasms finally subsided, Nolan noticed something strange about the boy's outstretched arm. It was moving, twitching slightly as if trying to claw its way towards him. He watched in horrified fascination as the finger joints began to bend backwards, one by one, until the hand seemed to defy all laws of nature. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The boy's body went still, but his hand remained poised like some grotesque parody of a beckoning gesture. Nolan felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead as he realized what this meant. Whatever had killed these people, whatever had done those things to their bodies, it wasn't finished yet. It was still here, somewhere in the darkness around him. Nolan stumbled away from the stream, his mind racing with feverish terror. He needed to get out of there. He needed to find a way back to safety before whatever had killed Morgan and the others came for him too. But as he moved deeper into the tunnel system, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was stalking him through the shadows. The air grew colder, heavier, until it seemed to press down upon him like a physical weight. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale tasting of rotting earth and decay. He rounded a corner and found himself face to face with another body, or what was left of one. It hung from the ceiling by its ankles, stripped of flesh, save for a few bloody tatters that dangled like grisly ribbons. The walls around it were smeared with blood, as if someone had tried to write a message in red before losing control entirely. Nolan pressed himself against the wall opposite, his heart hammering wildly in his chest. He knew he should keep moving, put as much distance between himself and this awful place as possible. But something made him pause, a glint of metal on the floor beneath the hanging corpse. He reached out cautiously, grabbing at it with trembling fingers. It was a flashlight, its body dented and broken, but still miraculously intact. He clicked the switch, relief flooding through him as the beam illuminated the darkness ahead. But his relief was short-lived. As he swung the light around, he saw more bodies, dozens of them, strewn throughout the tunnels like discarded dolls. And among them were others, things that shouldn't exist, twisted parodies of human beings with backwards bending limbs and skin splitting where it should not. They seemed to be merging. One creature had 3 arms, 2 legs, and a face that bore the features of at least 4 different people. Another appeared to have been stitched together from several bodies, its torso a grotesque patchwork of mismatched flesh. They moved with jerky, unnatural movements, their limbs clicking and popping like dry bones. Nolan felt panic rising within him again, threatening to overwhelm his senses completely. He knew he should run, should flee as fast as possible before these abominations could reach him. But all he could do was stand there, rooted to the spot by terror and disbelief. And then he heard it, a soft, wet clicking sound coming from behind him. The same noise he'd heard back in the cabin, when those creatures had first begun to merge together into something new and terrifying. Slowly, unwillingly, Nolan turned around. There, standing at the mouth of the tunnel behind him, was one of the creatures. It stood perfectly still, its backwards bending limbs clicking softly, as if it were studying him, learning him. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, bore into him like twin lasers, boring deep into his soul until he felt naked, exposed, violated. And in that moment, Nolan knew this was the source of all his fear, all his nightmares made flesh. This thing had learned how to imitate empathy, how to mimic human emotion so perfectly that it could lure its victims close before striking without mercy. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His body felt paralyzed, frozen in place by sheer terror. All he could do was watch as the creature took a step towards him, then another, each click of its limbs echoing through his very being like a death knell. Then something inside him snapped. Adrenaline surged through his veins, breaking the spell that had held him captive. He turned and ran, fleeing down the tunnel with the creature's clicking pursuit echoing behind him. Nolan's heart hammered in his chest like a trapped animal as he fled through the labyrinthine tunnels of Blackwood's hollow. The beam of his flashlight sliced through the darkness, illuminating the twisted landscape that seemed to twist and contort around him like a living thing. He could hear the creature behind him, its backwards bending limbs clicking like some monstrous metronome, ticking off the seconds until it caught up with him. Its footsteps echoed through the tunnels, each one resonating deep within his chest, making his heart feel as if it might burst from sheer terror. But despite the fear that threatened to consume him entirely, Nolan knew he had to keep moving. He couldn't allow himself to be caught by that thing again, not after what he'd seen it do to Morgan and all those other poor souls who'd found themselves trapped down here in this hellish place. He could still see them in his mind's eye, their bodies bloated and twisted, their skin split open like overripe fruit to reveal the pulsating horror beneath. And among them was that child, that poor innocent child whose back had been ruptured by something no human hand could have wrought. And then there were those things, those abominations that seemed to be merging together into something new and terrible. Nolan had never seen anything like it before. He hadn't even known such a thing was possible. But now, having witnessed it firsthand, he knew all too well the sheer horror of what was happening down here in Blackwood's Hollow. As he ran, Nolan felt a strange sensation prickling at the edges of his consciousness, something akin to understanding, as if some vast and terrible truth was beginning to dawn upon him. He tried to push it away, to focus instead on putting as much distance between himself and that clicking horror behind him as possible. But try as he might, he couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of realization that wormed its way deeper into his mind with every passing second. Suddenly, without warning, the tunnel ahead opened up into a vast cavern. Nolan skidded to a halt at its edge, his breath ragged in his lungs, his heart pounding like a drum in his ears. He shone his flashlight around, taking in the scene before him, more bodies strewn across the floor, more twisted creatures moving among them, like grotesque dancers at some infernal ball. But that wasn't what caught his attention. No. What drew his eye was something far more horrifying than anything he'd yet encountered. There, suspended from the ceiling by what looked like massive, fleshy ropes, hung a writhing mass of bodies and limbs and faces, twisted together into something that defied description. It seemed to pulse with a sickening rhythm, as if breathing independently of its constituent parts. And then Nolan realized why. Those ropes weren't ropes at all, but veins, thick and black and pulsating with dark energy. As he watched in horror, one of the creatures moved closer to the mass, its limbs clicking softly as it reached out towards it. Then, without warning, it seemed to merge into the writhing flesh, disappearing entirely within a matter of seconds. Nolan felt bile rise in his throat as he finally understood. This wasn't just some mindless beast that fed on human flesh. No, this was something far more terrifying than that. This was an intelligence, a consciousness, that had learned how to imitate empathy, how to mimic human emotion so perfectly that it could lure its victims close before absorbing them completely. And now, Nolan realized with a dawning sense of dread, it wanted him too. He turned to run, but it was too late. The creature that had been pursuing him emerged from the shadows behind him, its backwards bending limbs clicking menacingly as it approached. Its eyes bored into him once more, and Nolan felt that same paralyzing terror seize hold of his body like a vice. But this time, something within him fought back against the fear. He thought of Morgan, of how she died down here in this hellish place. He thought of all those other poor souls who'd met their end at the hands, or rather, limbs, of this monstrosity. And then he remembered something else, that child's hand moving unnaturally after death. That was when it hit him like a punch to the gut. The intelligence behind these atrocities wasn't singular but distributed across Blackwood's hollow itself. It learned, adapted, imitated empathy, and now it wanted to absorb him too. With this realization came a surge of adrenaline, breaking free from the creature's thrall once more. He turned and ran, darting through the cavern as fast as his legs would carry him. But no matter how far he went, no matter how many twists and turns he took, that clicking pursuit echoed behind him, relentless and unyielding. Finally, panting and exhausted, Nolan came to a halt in a small, circular chamber. There was nowhere left to run. He'd reached the end of the line. He shone his flashlight around wildly, searching for some means of escape, but there was none to be found. The walls were smooth and unbroken, offering no handholds or footholds. Trapped, cornered like an animal at bay, Nolan turned slowly, facing down that clicking horror as it emerged from the shadows behind him once more. Its backwards bending limbs clicked softly, tauntingly, as if savoring this moment of triumph over its prey. Nolan felt a strange calm wash over him then, replacing the terror that had consumed him moments earlier. He knew he was going to die down here in Blackwood's hollow. There could be no denying it now. But before he went, he would face his death head on, without fear or hesitation. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. And then, with every ounce of strength and courage he possessed, Nolan stepped forward towards that clicking horror, only for the ground beneath him to give way suddenly, swallowing him whole into darkness absolute. When he came to, he found himself lying on his back in a vast open space, filled with echoes of distant dripping water. His flashlight lay shattered beside him, its light extinguished forever. He reached up cautiously, feeling. Nolan lay there for an eternity, or so it seemed, his breath echoing eerily in the vast chamber. His body ached, but he was alive. Somehow, against all odds, he had survived the fall. He reached out, his fingers brushing against something cold and smooth, bone. Human bones, arranged in intricate patterns on the floor. He recoiled, nausea rising in his throat as he shone his dying flashlight around. The cavern was filled with them, bodies suspended from the ceiling like grotesque marionettes, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, faces frozen in eternal screams. Among them were children, their tiny forms desecrated by this unholy intelligence. And there, at the center of it all, was Morgan. Her eyes met his, filled with a silent plea for release. The air grew colder, heavier. That clicking sound resumed, echoing around him like a symphony of madness. He felt it again, that paralyzing fear threatening to consume him whole. But there was something else too, a pulsating rhythm, like the beat of a heart, resonating deep within Blackwood's hollow itself. Nolan forced himself to stand, his body protesting with every movement. He realized then why he'd survived the fall, why he'd been brought here. The intelligence wanted him alive, conscious, to witness its power, its triumph. It wanted him to understand that there was no escape, no rescue, only endless darkness and despair. He felt it then, a tickling sensation at his joints, like tiny claws prying at the sockets of his knees, his elbows, his hips. His bones shifted unnaturally beneath his skin, grinding against one another, as if trying to bend in directions they were never meant to go. He screamed, falling to the ground, convulsing as he fought against the invasion. But it was useless. The intelligence had learned from him, imitated his empathy, and now it sought to wear him like a suit of flesh. His limbs moved independently, betraying his commands, reaching out towards Morgan's suspended form. He could feel her terror, her desperation, as if it were his own. "No," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Not like this." With a final wrenching effort, Nolan forced himself to stillness. His body trembled, fought against him, but he held firm. And then, with a scream that echoed through Blackwood's hollow forever, he let go. His limbs moved in unison now, merging with Morgan's form, pulling her down from her suspension. They collided onto the floor together, bodies entwined, becoming one. The intelligence poured into him, filling him with its dark energy, but Nolan fought back. He reached deep inside himself, grabbing hold of that fear he'd felt upon entering Blackwood's hollow, the certainty that something irreversible had already happened. And then, with Morgan's eyes looking out through his own, Nolan opened his mouth and screamed again. But this time it was not a scream of terror or pain. It was one of defiance, of triumph. For in that moment, he understood. He had become the hollow's next host, but he would not be its puppet. As dawn broke outside, casting eerie shadows through Blackwood's hollow, Nolan felt something change within him. His body grew cold, still, and when he looked down at his hands, they were no longer his own. They belonged to Morgan now, to all those who had come before her, their spirits intertwined with his own. He walked towards the entrance of Blackwood's hollow, each step echoing like a death knell in the silence. Behind him, the clicking stopped forever. He was alone now, truly alone, forever bound to this place, these people, this monstrosity. But he had survived, and in surviving, he had ensured that no one else would ever find their way in or out. Nolan stepped outside into the pale light of dawn. The world seemed just a little bit darker now, as if the very air had been contaminated by what happened within Blackwood's hollow. He raised his hands towards the sky, feeling the first rays of sunlight upon his skin. And then, with one last look back at the entrance of that hellish place, Nolan turned away, disappearing into the shadows of the forest beyond. The world would never know what had happened here, but it didn't matter, for in the depths of Blackwood's hollow, something ancient and terrible had awakened. And it was no longer contained within those dark walls alone. It was out there now, in the light of day, carried upon the wind like a plague. And as Nolan walked away, his body forever changed. The world itself seemed to grow just a little bit darker still. As Nolan stepped further into the forest, he couldn't shake off the feeling that something had changed within him. His vision seemed sharper, colors more vibrant, yet everything appeared tinged with an unnatural hue, as if reality was now filtered through Blackwood's hollow. He came across a stream, its waters babbling over smooth pebbles. Kneeling down to drink, he noticed his reflection staring back at him, but it wasn't quite right. His eyes were sunken, hollow, like pools of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around them. And there, in the depths of those abyssal orbs, something else moved. A flicker of movement, too fast for him to catch. Standing up abruptly, Nolan felt a pang of unease. He turned to continue his journey but paused when he heard laughter. Children's laughter, carefree and joyous, echoing through the trees. It should have been comforting, reassuring even, yet it sent chills down his spine. Following the sound, he emerged into a clearing where several children played, oblivious to his presence. They were perfect, innocent replicas of those suspended in the cavern, except these ones were alive, whole, and as they played, their limbs moved unnaturally, bending backwards like those of the creature from Blackwood's hollow. They looked up at Nolan simultaneously, eyes filled with an intelligence far beyond their years. "Play with us," one of them said, its voice echoing in harmony with those of the others. "Stay here forever." Nolan stumbled back, horror coursing through him. He knew then that it wasn't just him who had changed. The world outside Blackwood's hollow had begun to shift as well. The intelligence was spreading, adapting, learning from everything it touched. Turning away from the children, Nolan broke into a run, desperation lending speed to his limbs. He needed to put distance between himself and this twisted parody of reality. But with each step, he felt that pulsating rhythm resonating deeper within him, echoing in time with his heartbeat. As he ran, trees began to twist and warp around him, their roots bursting from the ground like skeletal fingers reaching out to grab him. The forest floor undulated beneath his feet, threatening to swallow him whole. Above, the sky darkened, clouds swirling into a vortex that seemed to stretch down towards Nolan, eager to consume him. He could feel it now, the intelligence's hunger, its insatiable desire for knowledge, experience, empathy. It wanted everything he was, and everything he'd ever known, every memory, every emotion. And if it couldn't have those, it would settle for destruction. Nolan fell to his knees, clutching at his head as pain lanced through him. Behind closed eyes, he saw visions of Blackwood's hollow stretching out across the world. Cities crumbling under the weight of ancient horrors. Oceans churning with madness. Skies filled with monstrous forms that should never have existed. But amidst this chaos, there was something else too, a glimmer of hope perhaps. He saw people fighting back against the darkness, refusing to succumb. They were few and far between, but they were there, defiant in the face of oblivion. With renewed determination, Nolan pushed himself back up, staring into the vortex above him. "You want me?" he screamed. "Fine, but you'll have to come through me first." As if in response, tendrils of darkness snaked down from the sky, wrapping around him like chains. They pulled taut, lifting him off his feet as they began to drag him back towards Blackwood's hollow. Nolan struggled against them, but it was no use. He could feel himself being drawn inexorably into that chilling abyss once more. And then, with one final cry echoing through the twisted forest, he disappeared completely, swallowed whole by the darkness above. In the aftermath of his disappearance, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the trees began to straighten, their roots retracting into the earth. The ground stilled, the sky lightened, and the pulsating rhythm faded away, leaving behind an eerie silence. The beacon pulse stabilized. For a moment, just one, the web stopped tightening. Amelia felt it. That hesitation. That strange synchronization between her signal and the anomaly's heartbeat. The rhythm matched perfectly now. Not resistance. Not escape. Recognition. The web pulsed once. Twice. Then it answered. Not with force, but with understanding. The tendrils loosened slightly, not enough to free her, but enough to reposition her body. They adjusted her limbs with delicate precision, like surgical instruments guided by an intelligence far older than language. Her breathing slowed. Not because she willed it, but because something else had taken control of the rhythm. The heartbeat returned. Louder. Closer. Inside her helmet, warning indicators flared in silent red bursts across her visor. Biofeedback failure. Neural's synchronization detected. Signal loop established. Her pulse began to match the anomaly. Not metaphorically. Physically. Each beat of her heart struck in perfect time with the living web surrounding her. She tried to scream, but the sound that escaped her throat came out as static. Broken signal. Distorted transmission. Somewhere behind her, back aboard Aeternum, the communications console came alive. A new signal began broadcasting automatically. Uncommanded. Uncontrolled. Alive, designed. Her voice. Or something wearing it. This is Operator Amelia Voss, responding to anomaly. Signal received. Synchronization stable. She heard the transmission echo through her own helmet speakers. Her own words. But she hadn't spoken them. Not consciously. The web pulsed again, and the stars vanished. Not literally, but perceptually. They blurred into long streaks of white as her vision fragmented into overlapping signals, layers of memory, perception, and data folding over one another like collapsing architecture. And then, she saw them. Hundreds of times. Thousands. Suspended within the web. Shapes. Bodies. Fragments of suits and helmets, old, torn, hollow. Radio operators. Explorers. Observers. Each one connected. Each one still moving. Not alive. Not dead. Something else. Stored. Preserved. Broadcasting. A terrible understanding unfolded within her mind. The stalker wasn't hunting. It wasn't killing. It was collecting. Signal. Voice. Consciousness. Every operator who had ever responded to its call had become part of its network. A living archive. A chorus of voices feeding its endless hunger for contact. For recognition. For connection. The tendril around her wrist tightened. Not violently. Gently. Almost reverently. It slid beneath the outer layer of her suit, phasing through matter like light through fog, until it pressed against her skin. Her visor cracked. Not shattered, split. A thin fracture line spidered across the glass as pressure mounted from within. Her thoughts began dissolving into patterns, into pulses, into signal. Memory after memory bled outward into the network. Her childhood, her training, her first flight, every fear, every triumph, every moment. Shared, stored, consumed. And yet, she remained aware, horribly aware, Still watching. Still feeling. Still understanding what was happening to her. Her body convulsed once as the web embedded deeper, threading itself into neural pathways like roots seeking water. Then everything went still. Sealant. Perfectly synchronized. Back aboard Eternum, the transmission continued. Steady. Clear. Uninterrupted. This is Operator Amelia Voss. Anomaly confirmed. Synchronization successful. Signal safe to approach. The message repeated. Again. And again. And again. Across every frequency. Across every listening station. Across every empty stretch of space where lonely operators searched for something to answer the silence. And far beyond the visible stars, the web expanded. Slowly. Patiently. Growing outward into the infinite dark. Waiting. Listening. Touch. Calling. Always calling. And somewhere inside that living lattice of signal and flesh, Amelia remained awake. Forever broadcasting. Forever listening. Forever part of the network. Still calling for help. Still guiding the next voice closer. Because in the infinite dark between stars, something was always listening. And it had learned how to speak.